Detective Jake Thompson stepped out of his black SUV and straightened his tactical vest with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. The morning sun reflected off his polished badge as he walked through the parking lot of the Los Angeles Police Department's elite SWAT facility. Other officers nodded respectfully as he passed, some with genuine admiration, others with barely hidden fear. Jake had earned his reputation the hard way. 15 years on the force, with the last 8 spent in SWAT operations. His arrest record was impressive, his conviction rate even more so. The local newspapers had featured him twice in the past year alone, calling him LA's finest and the officer who gets results. The department brass loved him because he closed cases. His fellow officers respected him because he always had their backs during dangerous operations. But somewhere along the way, success had changed Jake. What started as healthy confidence had slowly twisted into something darker. He began to see himself as above the regular rules that applied to other officers. When civilians questioned his methods, he would remind them who kept their streets safe. When younger officers suggested different approaches, he would shut them down with stories of his own heroic actions. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with small things. Taking the best parking spots without asking, speaking over colleagues during briefings, making decisions without consulting his team. His supervisors noticed but chose to overlook these minor issues because Jake delivered results when it mattered most. His apartment reflected his growing ego. The walls were covered with commendations, newspaper clippings, and photos of him with city officials. His coffee table displayed challenge coins from various law enforcement agencies, each one representing a successful operation or recognition from peers. Jake would often invite dates over just to show off these trophies, recounting tales of high-stakes raids and dangerous criminals he had apprehended. The morning started like any other, with Jake reviewing case files in his office. His partner knocked and entered without waiting for permission, something that would have annoyed Jake if it had been anyone else. But Officer Rodriguez had been working with Jake for 3 years and had learned to navigate his increasingly difficult personality. "Chief wants to see you," Rodriguez said, holding up a manila folder. Something about a special assignment. Jake barely looked up from his computer screen. "Tell him I'm busy. Whatever it is can wait until I finish this report." He said it was urgent. Something about the British royal family. That got Jake's attention. He leaned back in his chair and finally made eye contact with his partner. "The Royals? What do they want with SWAT?" "Apparently they're visiting Los Angeles next week. Big security operation. The chief is handpicking officers for the detail." Jake stood up and grabbed his jacket. This sounded like exactly the kind of high-profile assignment that would look good on his record. He could already imagine the photos, the media attention, the recognition from federal agencies. This was the kind of opportunity that could launch him into even higher positions within the department, or maybe even federal law enforcement. The walk to the chief's office felt longer than usual. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. Would he be leading the security detail? Would there be opportunities to work with Secret Service agents? This could be the career-defining moment he had been waiting for. Chief Williams was waiting with several other senior officers when Jake arrived. The room had the serious atmosphere that usually accompanied major operations or disciplinary actions. Jake hoped it was the former as he took a seat at the conference table. "Thompson, I'm putting you on the Royal Security Detail," the chief began, sliding a thick folder across the table. "But I need to be clear about something. This isn't a SWAT operation. This is diplomatic security with a heavy emphasis on protocol and respect." Jake opened the folder and began scanning the documents. His enthusiasm started to fade as he read about ceremonial procedures, diplomatic protocols, and coordination with British security personnel. This wasn't the action-packed assignment he had imagined. "Sir, with respect, wouldn't my skills be better used in a more tactical role? I could coordinate perimeter security or handle threat assessment." Chief Williams shook his head. "The assignment is what it is, Thompson. The British have their own security team, including Royal Guards who will be handling close protection. Your job is to support their operations and maintain good relations with our international allies." The word support stuck in Jake's throat like a bitter pill. He had spent years building a reputation as a leader, someone who took charge and made things happen. The idea of playing a supporting role to foreign officers felt like a step backward. "What exactly will these Royal Guards be doing?" Jake asked, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. traditional ceremonial duties along with actual security work. They're highly trained professionals with years of experience protecting the royal family. Some of them have military backgrounds from conflicts around the world. Jake nodded politely, but inside he was already forming opinions about these so-called professionals. In his mind, real police work happened on the streets of American cities, not in the controlled environment of royal palaces. How much actual danger could these guards have faced compared to the daily reality of Los Angeles crime? The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from dress codes to communication protocols. Jake found himself increasingly frustrated with the emphasis on ceremony and tradition. He had built his career on decisive action and practical results, not on following ancient protocols that seemed designed more for show than for actual security. As the meeting ended, Chief Williams pulled Jake aside. "I chose you for this assignment because you're one of our best officers, but I need you to understand that this is about more than just security. This is about representing our department and our country on an international stage. I need you to be on your best behavior." Jake nodded and shook the chief's hand, but the warning felt unnecessary. He was a professional who had never let the department down. Sure, he could be demanding and direct, but that's what made him effective. He certainly wasn't going to let some ceremonial assignment change his approach to law enforcement. Walking back to his office, Jake's mind was already working on how to make the best of this situation. Maybe he could use this assignment to network with federal agencies or international law enforcement. Perhaps there would be opportunities to showcase American policing methods to these foreign officers. He spent the rest of the day reading through the protocol manuals and security briefings, growing more skeptical with each page. The level of ceremony and tradition seemed excessive for what was essentially a public relations visit. In Jake's experience, the best security was invisible and efficient, not wrapped up in fancy uniforms and ancient rituals. By the end of the day, Jake had convinced himself that this assignment would be an easy week of babysitting foreign dignitaries while maintaining his perfect record. He had no idea that his attitude toward tradition, respect, and international cooperation was about to be tested in ways that would change his life forever. The sun was setting over Los Angeles as Jake drove home, completely unaware that in less than a week, his name would be known around the world for all the wrong reasons. The Beverly Hills Hotel looked like a fortress on Monday morning. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway, and officers in suits spoke quietly into their earpieces. Jake pulled into the parking area reserved for law enforcement and couldn't help but notice the difference between his tactical gear and the formal attire of the federal agents already on scene. Inside the hotel's grand ballroom, the security briefing was about to begin. Jake grabbed a cup of coffee and found a seat near the back, scanning the room to identify the key players. Secret Service agents sat near the front, their crisp suits and serious expressions marking them as the primary authority. Local police supervisors filled the middle rows, while various support personnel scattered throughout the remaining seats. Then Jake saw them. 3 men in red military uniforms stood near the side wall, their tall black hats making them impossible to miss. The Royal Guards looked exactly like the tourist postcards Jake had seen of London, complete with gold buttons and white gloves. He had to suppress a laugh. In a room full of serious law enforcement professionals, these guys looked like they were heading to a costume party. The lead Secret Service agent called the meeting to order and began outlining the security plan. Jake half listened as the agent discussed perimeter control, crowd management, and communication protocols. His attention kept drifting back to the 3 guards, who stood at perfect attention throughout the entire briefing. When the agent finished his presentation, he introduced the British security team. Sergeant William Hayes from the Coldstream Guards will be coordinating ceremonial aspects of tomorrow's visit. He has 15 years of experience in royal protection and has served in Afghanistan and Iraq before joining the Queen's Guard. Jake watched as Hayes stepped forward. The man was probably in his late 30s with the kind of rigid posture that screamed military training. When he spoke, his British accent was crisp and professional. "Thank you for the introduction. My team and I are honored to work alongside American law enforcement during this visit. We understand that our traditions may seem unfamiliar, but I assure you that every aspect of our procedures serves a security purpose." Jake rolled his eyes. Everything this guy said sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. The whole honored to work alongside routine felt fake to Jake, who preferred straight talk to diplomatic pleasantries. Hayes continued his presentation, explaining the ceremonial timeline and the specific roles each uniform would play. Jake found himself getting more irritated by the minute. Why did everything have to be so complicated? In his experience, good security was about being alert, mobile, and ready to respond to threats. All this ceremony just seemed like unnecessary decoration. During the break, Jake made his way to the coffee station where Hayes was standing alone reviewing his notes. This seemed like a good opportunity to get a read on the guy and maybe establish some ground rules about how things would work. "So you're the head toy soldier," Jake said, reaching for a sugar packet. "Must be nice having a job where you just stand around looking pretty." Hayes looked up from his papers, clearly surprised by the comment. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced." "You are." "Detective Jake Thompson, SWAT Division. I've been doing real police work while you've been playing dress-up for tourists." The British sergeant's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "I see. Well, Detective Thompson, I can assure you that our role tomorrow involves more than standing around. We'll be responsible for close protection of the royal family members, which requires constant vigilance and split-second decision-making." Jake laughed and shook his head. "Right, split-second decisions like which way to turn your head when someone wants a photo. Must be exhausting." Other officers nearby had started to notice the conversation, some moving closer to listen. Hayes glanced around the room before responding, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the exchange. "Detective, I understand that our methods may seem different from what you're used to, but I'd appreciate if you could keep an open mind. We're all here for the same purpose." "No, we're not," Jake shot back, his voice getting louder. "I'm here to actually protect people. You're here to put on a show." "There's a big difference." Hayes set down his coffee cup and faced Jake directly. "I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq before joining the Queen's Guard. I've protected members of the royal family through terrorist threats, assassination attempts, and hostile crowds in dozens of countries. With respect, Detective, this isn't a show." Jake felt his face getting hot. He didn't like being corrected, especially in front of other officers. "Oh, so now you're a war hero too? Let me guess, you've got medals and commendations and all that military stuff to prove how tough you are." "I don't need to prove anything to you," Hayes replied calmly. "I'm simply here to do my job and ensure tomorrow's event goes smoothly." By now, the conversation had attracted the attention of most of the room. Jake could see other officers watching, some looking uncomfortable with his aggressive tone, but he was in too deep to back down now. "Your job," Jake said, emphasizing each word, "is to stand there and look traditional, while real cops handle the actual security work. Don't confuse ceremony with law enforcement." Hayes took a deep breath before responding. "Detective Thompson, I think perhaps we should focus on tomorrow's mission, rather than debating our respective qualifications. We'll be working in close proximity, and it would be better for everyone if we could maintain a professional relationship." The diplomatic response only made Jake angrier. He interpreted Hayes's calm demeanor as condescension, as if the British officer thought he was above engaging in a real argument. Jake had dealt with plenty of suspects who tried to act superior, and he wasn't about to let this costume-wearing tourist treat him the same way. "Professional relationship?" Jake laughed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "I don't have professional relationships with people who play dress-up for a living. I work with real cops who deal with real criminals, not palace guards who worry about which fork to use at dinner." The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the Secret Service agents had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Hayes looked around at all the staring faces before turning back to Jake. "I think this conversation has gone far enough. Perhaps we should both focus on preparing for tomorrow." Hayes started to walk away, but Jake wasn't finished. He followed a few steps, calling after him loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's right, walk away. Just like you'll probably run away tomorrow if any real trouble starts. Good thing there will be actual police officers there to handle the situation." Hayes stopped and turned around one more time. For just a moment, Jake saw something flash in the British officer's eyes. Anger, frustration, or maybe just disappointment. But Hayes simply nodded politely and continued walking toward his team members. The room slowly returned to normal conversation, but Jake could feel eyes on him as he returned to his seat. Some officers looked amused by the confrontation, while others seemed uncomfortable with how aggressively he had attacked a visiting ally. Jake didn't care. In his mind, he had established his position and made it clear that he wouldn't be impressed by fancy uniforms and foreign accents. As the briefing resumed, Jake sat back in his chair with a satisfied expression. He had no idea that his public humiliation of Sergeant Hayes had been witnessed by officers who would remember every word. Nor did he realize that his attitude toward international cooperation and respect for allies had just created enemies within his own department. Tomorrow's event was supposed to be a routine diplomatic visit, but Jake had just turned it into something much more personal. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would change both men's lives forever. Tuesday morning arrived with perfect California weather. The sun was shining and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the streets of Beverly Hills. But inside the security perimeter around the hotel, tension hung in the air like fog. Jake arrived early, parking his patrol car in the designated law enforcement area. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying yesterday's confrontation with Hayes. Part of him regretted being so aggressive, but a bigger part felt justified. Someone needed to put these foreign visitors in their place and show them how real American law enforcement operated. The hotel entrance had been transformed overnight. Red carpet stretched from the curb to the front doors, while velvet ropes created pathways for the royal procession. Media crews set up cameras behind barriers, their telephoto lenses already focused on the entrance. Tourist crowds gathered across the street, many holding small British flags and homemade signs welcoming the royal visitors. Jake checked in with the command post and received his assignment for the day. He would be stationed near the main entrance, helping to manage crowd control and coordinate with other officers. It wasn't the high-profile position he had hoped for, but at least he would be visible when the cameras started rolling. As he walked toward his position, Jake noticed Hayes and his two fellow guards setting up near the hotel entrance. They were checking equipment, adjusting their uniforms, and going through what looked like rehearsed movements. Everything they did seemed precise and deliberate, like actors preparing for a performance. Jake positioned himself about 20 feet away, close enough to watch but far enough to avoid another direct confrontation. He pulled out his radio and began running through communication checks with other officers around the perimeter. The familiar routine of security work helped calm his nerves and reminded him why he was good at his job. Around 10 in the morning, word came through the radio that the royal motorcade was 15 minutes out. Immediately, the entire security operation shifted into high gear. Officers took their final positions, media crews adjusted their equipment, and the crowd noise grew louder with anticipation. Hayes and his team moved into their ceremonial formation near the red carpet. They stood perfectly still, their red uniforms bright against the hotel's beige facade. Jake had to admit they looked impressive, even if he still thought the whole thing was unnecessary theater. The motorcade arrived exactly on schedule. Black limousines with tinted windows pulled up to the entrance while motorcycle police blocked nearby intersections. Jake watched as Secret Service agents emerged first, scanning the crowd and communicating through their earpieces. Everything was going according to plan. Then the royal family members stepped out of their vehicles. Jake had seen them on television before, but seeing them in person was different. They moved with a kind of natural dignity that commanded attention without demanding it. The crowd erupted in cheers as they waved and smiled. This was when Hayes and his team went into action. They positioned themselves alongside the red carpet, creating a formal corridor for the royal family to walk through. Their movements were synchronized perfectly, like a military unit that had practiced together for years. Jake found himself getting irritated all over again. While he and the other officers were doing the real security work, watching for threats, managing crowds, coordinating communications, these three guards were just standing there looking decorative. It seemed like a waste of resources and a misuse of trained personnel. As the royal procession began moving toward the hotel entrance, Jake noticed something that made his blood boil. Hayes had positioned himself directly in the path that Jake needed to use to reach his secondary position. According to the security plan, Jake was supposed to move to the other side of the entrance once the royal family was safely inside the building. Jake started walking toward his new position, expecting Hayes to notice and step aside. But the British sergeant remained perfectly still, focused on the approaching royal family members. Jake found himself having to walk around the formation, which he interpreted as a deliberate slight. "Excuse me," Jake said loudly as he approached Hayes. "I need to get through here." Hayes glanced over without moving from his position. "I'm sorry, Detective, but we're in the middle of the ceremonial procession." Could you please wait just a moment until the family passes? The request was polite and reasonable, but Jake heard it as an order. No foreign officer was going to tell him where he could or couldn't go, especially not in front of cameras and crowds. He was an American police officer on American soil, and he outranked any ceremonial guard. No, I can't wait, Jake replied, his voice getting louder. I have a job to do, and I'm not going to stand around while you play soldier. By now, the royal family was only about 30 feet away, walking slowly and greeting people in the crowd. Hayes looked torn between maintaining his ceremonial position and dealing with Jake's aggressive behavior. Other officers nearby had started to notice the confrontation. Detective Thompson, please, Hayes said quietly, trying to keep his voice down. This will only take another minute. Then I'll be happy to move wherever you need me to. But Jake was beyond reasoning. Yesterday's humiliation, his frustration with the assignment, and his general resentment toward the whole situation had built up to a breaking point. He stepped closer to Hayes, invading his personal space. Don't tell me what to do, Jake said through gritted teeth. You're not a real cop, you're just a tourist in a costume. Get out of my way. Hayes remained calm but firm. Sir, I'm asking you respectfully to wait just one moment. The royal family is approaching, and I cannot abandon my position during the ceremony. That word, ceremony, was like a match thrown on gasoline. Jake had been hearing about ceremony and tradition and protocol for days, and he was sick of it. Real police work wasn't about ceremony. It was about action, results, and getting the job done regardless of how it looked. I don't care about your stupid ceremony, Jake shouted, loud enough that people in the crowd started turning to look. Move now or I'll move you myself. The royal family was now only 15 feet away. Cameras were rolling, phones were recording, and hundreds of people were watching. Hayes looked desperately around for help, but every other officer was focused on their own responsibilities. Detective, please, Hayes said one more time. I cannot leave my post. Surely you understand duty and following orders. The implication that Jake didn't understand duty was the final straw. In that moment, 15 years of police training, departmental policies, and professional conduct vanished. Jake saw only a foreign officer, who had disrespected him in front of his peers, and was now blocking his path while lecturing him about duty. Jake's hand moved faster than his brain could process the consequences. The slap connected with Hayes's left cheek with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire street. The British sergeant's head snapped to the side, his tall black hat falling to the ground. For a moment, everything stopped. The crowd fell silent. Cameras kept rolling, but operators stood frozen behind them. Even the royal family paused in their procession, though their security immediately moved to shield them from whatever was happening. Hayes slowly turned his head back toward Jake, a red mark already visible on his cheek. His expression showed more shock than anger, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. He bent down to retrieve his hat, his movements careful and deliberate. Jake stood there breathing heavily, his hand still raised slightly from the slap. Part of him felt satisfied that he had finally put this arrogant foreigner in his place, but another part of him was already beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had just done. Around them, the security operation continued as other officers moved to manage the situation. The royal family was quickly escorted inside the hotel while cameras captured every angle of the confrontation. Jake could hear his radio crackling with urgent communications, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Hayes straightened his uniform and replaced his hat. When he looked at Jake again, there was something different in his eyes. Not anger or hatred, but a kind of profound disappointment that somehow felt worse than any shouting match would have been. Within seconds, Jake's supervisor was at his side, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the scene. Other officers moved to separate the two men while trying to maintain the security perimeter. The professional operation that had been planned for months was now in chaos because of one moment of uncontrolled anger. As Jake was led away, he could see phone screens everywhere, already uploading videos of the incident to social media. The sound of camera shutters seemed deafening, and he realized that his moment of rage had been captured by dozens of devices. The perfect California morning had turned into a nightmare, and Jake was just beginning to understand that there would be no going back from what he had done. The first notification came while Jake was sitting in the back of a police supervisor's car, his hands shaking as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. His phone buzzed once, then twice, then started buzzing continuously as messages flooded in, faster than he could read them. Lieutenant Rodriguez, his immediate supervisor, had pulled him away from the hotel entrance within seconds of the incident. The older officer's face was a mixture of anger and disbelief as he spoke rapidly into his radio, coordinating damage control while keeping Jake isolated from the media chaos erupting around them. "What the hell were you thinking?" Rodriguez finally asked, turning around from the front seat to face Jake. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Jake's mouth felt dry as cotton. He tried to form words to explain his actions, but everything that came to mind sounded weak and pathetic. How could he explain that a British guard's refusal to move had triggered such rage? How could he justify striking a foreign ally in front of international media? "He was blocking my path," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't move when I told him to." Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "Jake, you just assaulted a member of the British Royal Guard during an official diplomatic visit. On camera, in front of hundreds of witnesses." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had been so focused on his anger toward Hayes that he hadn't fully processed the broader implications. This wasn't just a fight between two officers. This was an international incident involving allies, diplomats, and royal family members. His phone continued buzzing incessantly. Jake glanced at the screen and saw dozens of missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Text messages were pouring in from colleagues, friends, and family members. Most contained variations of the same question. "Is this really you?" Jake opened his social media apps and immediately wished he hadn't. The video was everywhere, multiple angles of the slap, taken by tourists, media crews, and security cameras. The hashtag SWAT slap was already trending, with thousands of shares and comments pouring in every minute. The comments were brutal. People from around the world were expressing outrage at his behavior. British citizens were particularly angry, calling him everything from a disgrace to his badge to an embarrassment to America. Even Americans were criticizing him, saying he had dishonored the country and damaged relationships with important allies. One video had been taken by a tourist standing directly behind the incident. It showed the entire confrontation in crystal clear detail, including Jake's aggressive posture and raised voice. Worst of all, it captured the moment of the slap with sickening clarity. Jake could see his own face twisted with anger, looking nothing like the professional officer he thought himself to be. "Turn off the phone," Rodriguez ordered. "Right now. Don't read anything else, don't respond to anyone, and don't make any statements." Jake reluctantly powered down his device, but he could still hear other officers' radios crackling with urgent communications. Units were being repositioned, supervisors were being notified, and damage control protocols were being activated. The entire security operation had been thrown into chaos because of his moment of rage. Through the car window, Jake could see the aftermath of his actions. Media crews that had been focused on covering the royal visit were now turning their cameras toward the police vehicles. Reporters were frantically making phone calls and typing on laptops, filing urgent updates about the incident. The royal family had been safely escorted inside the hotel, but their schedule was now completely disrupted. Security teams were reassessing every aspect of the visit, trying to determine if the incident represented a broader threat or was an isolated problem with one officer. Lieutenant Rodriguez's radio crackled with an urgent message from headquarters. "All units, be advised that Detective Thompson is being relieved of duty effective immediately. He is to be transported directly to Internal Affairs for questioning." Jake felt his stomach drop. Internal Affairs investigations were serious business, often ending careers and sometimes leading to criminal charges. He had always assumed that his track record and reputation would protect him from major consequences, but this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. As they drove toward police headquarters, Jake's mind raced with thoughts about his future. 15 years of service, hundreds of successful arrests, countless commendations and awards, all of it now overshadowed by 30 seconds of uncontrolled anger. He tried to remember if he had ever heard of an officer recovering from something this public and embarrassing. The radio continued providing updates about the incident's impact. News stations were interrupting regular programming to report the story. Social media platforms were struggling to keep up with the volume of posts and shares. International news outlets were picking up the story, with headlines like "American Officer Attacks British Guard," appearing on websites around the world. Jake realized that his name was probably being mentioned on television right now. Reporters were likely digging through his background, looking for previous incidents or warning signs. His neighbors, his ex-wife, his children, they would all be seeing this coverage and learning about his disgrace along with the rest of the world. When they arrived at headquarters, Jake was surprised to see reporters already gathering outside the building. Someone had leaked his name and department information, and the media was hungry for more details about the officer who had created an international incident. Rodriguez parked in the rear garage to avoid the cameras and escorted Jake through a back entrance. Even inside the building, Jake could feel the stares of fellow officers. Some looked angry, others disappointed, and a few seemed almost amused by his downfall. Word traveled fast in police departments, and everyone knew what had happened. The Internal Affairs office was on the 3rd floor, a sterile environment that Jake had never visited before. Sergeant Collins, the lead investigator, was waiting with a thick file folder and a digital recorder. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Jake could sense the gravity of the situation in her demeanor. "Detective Thompson, you're here regarding incident number 2024 IA-187, involving an assault on a foreign diplomatic security officer during official duties. You have the right to union representation during this interview." Jake nodded and asked for his union representative to be contacted. While they waited, he sat in silence, trying to process how quickly his life had changed. 2 hours ago, he had been a respected SWAT officer working a high-profile security detail. Now he was facing internal affairs investigation and possible criminal charges. His phone, though turned off, seemed to weigh heavily in his pocket. He knew that when he eventually turned it back on, there would be hundreds more messages waiting. Reporters seeking comments, colleagues expressing shock, family members demanding explanations. The outside world was reacting to his moment of rage, and there was no way to stop the avalanche he had started. Through the office window, Jake could see news helicopters circling overhead. The story was big enough to warrant aerial coverage, which meant it would be the lead story on evening news broadcasts. His face and name would be broadcast into millions of homes across the country and around the world. The union representative arrived 30 minutes later, looking grim and professional. Before the formal interview began, he pulled Jake aside for a private consultation. His advice was simple but devastating. Prepare for the worst-case scenario, because this incident had all the elements that departments and prosecutors love to pursue aggressively. As they sat down for the recorded interview, Jake realized that his career was probably over. The question now wasn't whether he would face consequences, but how severe those consequences would be. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, federal investigations, all of these possibilities were now on the table because of one moment when he had lost control. The slap that had lasted less than a second had created ripple effects that would continue spreading for months or years to come. Jake was about to learn that in the age of social media and instant global communication, there was no such thing as a private moment of anger for a public servant. 3 days after the incident, Detective Riley Walsh from Internal Affairs opened her laptop and stared at the growing pile of evidence on her desk. What had started as a straightforward assault investigation was turning into something much larger and more disturbing. The deeper she dug into Jake Thompson's background, the more troubling patterns emerged. Riley had been investigating police misconduct for 8 years, and she had developed a keen eye for spotting officers whose behavior showed escalating problems. Jake's case was setting off every alarm bell in her experienced mind. The slap at the hotel wasn't an isolated incident. It was the explosive climax of years of increasingly problematic behavior. The first breakthrough came when Officer Chen from the Patrol Division called the Internal Affairs hotline. Chen had been reluctant to come forward, but the international attention on Jake's case had given him the courage to speak up about incidents he had witnessed but never reported. "I saw Detective Thompson grab a suspect by the throat during a routine traffic stop last year," Chen told Riley during a recorded interview. The guy was already handcuffed and wasn't resisting, but Thompson got angry because the suspect was talking back to him. He slammed the guy against the car and told him to shut up or things would get worse. Riley made careful notes as Chen continued his account. The officer described how Jake had threatened to file false charges against the suspect if he filed a complaint. Chen had wanted to report the incident at the time, But Jake's reputation and connections within the department had intimidated him into staying quiet. Thompson told me that good cops stick together and don't cause problems for each other, Chen explained. He said that if I made trouble for him, he would make sure I had problems with my evaluations and promotion opportunities. This revelation prompted Riley to dig deeper into Jake's arrest records and civilian complaints. What she found was a pattern of excessive force incidents that had been consistently dismissed or downgraded by supervisors. Suspects had complained about unnecessary violence, verbal abuse, and intimidation tactics, but most of their complaints had been classified as unfounded or exonerated. The second major break came from an unexpected source. Detective Lisa Park from the Robbery Division had heard about the investigation and decided to share her own experiences with Jake's behavior. During their interview, she revealed a culture of bullying and intimidation that Jake had created within certain units. He would corner new officers and tell them horror stories about what happened to cops who didn't follow his lead, Park explained. He made it clear that crossing him would hurt their careers. Some of the younger officers were genuinely afraid of him. Park described incidents where Jake had taken credit for other officers' work, manipulated evidence reports to make himself look better, and used his influence with supervisors to protect himself from scrutiny. She had never spoken up because Jake had allies in high places and a reputation for retaliating against anyone who challenged him. The worst part was how he treated civilians, Park continued. He would use his badge and gun to intimidate people during routine interactions. Traffic stops would turn into power trips where he would humiliate drivers for minor violations. He seemed to enjoy making people feel helpless and afraid. Riley's investigation expanded to include a review of Jake's body camera footage from the past 2 years. What she found was deeply disturbing. Jake routinely turned off his camera during confrontational situations, claiming technical difficulties or forgotten activations. When footage did exist, it showed a pattern of aggressive behavior that bordered on harassment. In one video from 6 months earlier, Jake could be seen berating a homeless man for sleeping in a doorway. Instead of offering resources or assistance, Jake threatened the man with arrest and forced him to dump out his belongings on the sidewalk. The man was clearly mentally ill and posed no threat, but Jake treated him like a dangerous criminal. Another video showed Jake conducting a search of a young Latino man's car during a traffic stop. The stop had been for a broken taillight, but Jake spent 45 minutes searching every inch of the vehicle, while making disparaging comments about immigrants and gang members. No drugs or weapons were found, but Jake's report claimed the driver had been acting suspiciously. The pattern was clear and consistent. Jake used his authority to bully, intimidate, and humiliate people who couldn't fight back. His victims were typically minorities, poor people, or individuals with mental health issues, people who were unlikely to file complaints or be believed if they did. Riley's investigation also uncovered evidence of Jake's manipulation of police reports. In several cases, he had exaggerated the level of resistance or threat posed by suspects to justify his use of force. Witnesses described peaceful arrests that Jake's reports portrayed as violent confrontations, requiring aggressive intervention. One particularly damaging case involved a domestic violence call from 8 months earlier. The female victim had initially cooperated with Jake's investigation, but later recanted her statement and refused to press charges. Riley tracked down the woman and discovered the real reason for her change of heart. Detective Thompson told me that if I testified against my boyfriend, he would make sure everyone knew I was a snitch, the woman explained during a confidential interview. He said that drug dealers don't like snitches and that bad things happen to people who cooperate with police. I was more afraid of him than I was of my boyfriend. This revelation led Riley to examine other cases where witnesses had mysteriously become uncooperative or victims had refused to pursue charges. She found a pattern of Jake using intimidation tactics to manipulate the outcome of investigations, particularly in cases where his conduct might be questioned. The investigation took another serious turn when Riley discovered that Jake had been accessing police databases to conduct unauthorized searches on personal acquaintances, ex-girlfriends, and even fellow officers. Database logs showed that he had been looking up addresses, vehicle registrations, and criminal histories for people who had nothing to do with his assigned cases. When Riley confronted the IT department about these database searches, she learned that Jake had been doing this for years. The IT supervisor had noticed the unusual activity but had never reported it, because Jake had convinced him that the searches were related to ongoing investigations. Told me he was working undercover, cases that required discretion, the IT supervisor explained. He said that if I asked too many questions or generated reports about his database activity, it could compromise sensitive operations and put officers at risk. Riley realized that Jake had been using his reputation and authority to silence potential whistleblowers throughout the department. Officers, civilian employees, and supervisors had all been manipulated into covering for his misconduct through a combination of intimidation, false friendship, and implied threats. The scope of Jake's misconduct was staggering. Riley's investigation had uncovered evidence of excessive force, witness intimidation, database abuse, evidence tampering, and systematic bullying of colleagues. What had started as a simple assault case had revealed a pattern of corruption that had been hidden for years. As Riley compiled her findings, she realized that Jake's behavior had infected multiple units within the department. His influence had created a culture where misconduct was tolerated and reporting problems was discouraged. Other officers had learned to look the other way or actively participate in covering up incidents to avoid becoming targets themselves. The most shocking discovery came when Riley interviewed Jake's former partner, Officer Williams, who had requested a transfer 6 months earlier. Williams revealed that he had been documenting Jake's misconduct for over a year, keeping detailed notes and even recording some conversations. I knew that someday someone would investigate him, and I wanted to be ready with evidence, Williams explained, but I was too scared to come forward while I was still working with him. He had made it clear that betraying him would end my career. Williams provided Riley with a notebook containing dates, times, and detailed descriptions of misconduct incidents. He also had audio recordings of Jake bragging about manipulating suspects and witnesses, using racial slurs, and discussing ways to avoid departmental oversight. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Jake Thompson wasn't just an officer who had lost his temper during a high-pressure situation. He was a corrupt cop who had been abusing his authority for years while using intimidation and manipulation to avoid consequences. Riley's investigation had revealed that the SLAP heard around the world was just the tip of an iceberg. Beneath the surface was a pattern of misconduct so extensive that it would require a complete review of every case Jake had worked on and every arrest he had made. The department was facing not just an international embarrassment, but a potential crisis of credibility that could take years to resolve. The phone call came at 6 in the morning on a rainy Thursday, exactly 2 weeks after the incident. Jake had been expecting it, but hearing Chief Williams's voice delivering the news still felt like a punch to the gut. Thompson, I need you to come in today for a final meeting with the disciplinary board. Bring your badge, your weapon, and any department property you have at home. Jake stared at the ceiling of his small apartment, listening to the rain tap against the windows. He had spent the last 2 weeks in limbo, suspended without pay while the investigation continued. His savings account was already running low, and the bills kept coming regardless of his employment status. What time do you need me there, Chief? 10 o'clock. And Jake? Bring a lawyer if you have one. This isn't going to be a pleasant conversation. After hanging up, Jake sat on the edge of his bed and tried to process what was about to happen. 15 years of his life were about to be officially erased. All the training, the long hours, the dangerous situations he had faced, none of it mattered anymore. He would be remembered only as the cop who slapped a royal guard on international television. The drive to headquarters felt like a funeral procession. Jake passed familiar landmarks from his patrol days, remembering when he had felt proud to wear the badge and serve the community. Now those same streets felt foreign and hostile, as if the entire city knew about his disgrace. The parking lot at headquarters was busier than usual, with news vans stationed across the street. Word had leaked that Jake's disciplinary hearing was happening today, and reporters were hoping to catch footage of him arriving or leaving. Jake used the back entrance to avoid the cameras, but he could feel the weight of public attention even from inside the building. The disciplinary board consisted of 3 senior commanders, the police chief, and a representative from the city attorney's office. Jake had appeared before similar panels as a witness in other officers' cases, but being on the receiving end felt completely different. The formal atmosphere and official language made everything feel final and irreversible. Chief Williams read from a prepared statement that outlined the charges against Jake: assault on a foreign diplomatic officer, conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of department policies regarding use of force, bringing discredit to the department. Each charge felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. Detective Thompson, the investigation has also revealed multiple instances of misconduct spanning several years. These include unauthorized database searches, witness intimidation, excessive use of force, and filing false or misleading reports. Jake's lawyer, a tired-looking man named Peterson, who specialized in police disciplinary cases, tried to negotiate a resignation in lieu of termination. He argued that Jake's long service record and previous commendations should be considered as mitigating factors. My client made a serious mistake, but he's been a dedicated officer for 15 years. Surely there's a way to resolve this that doesn't involve destroying his entire career. The board members exchanged glances before Chief Williams responded. Mr. Peterson, this case has received international attention and damaged our relationships with foreign law enforcement agencies. The video has been viewed millions of times worldwide. There is no quiet resolution to this situation. The city attorney representative spoke up for the first time. Additionally, we're facing potential federal civil rights violations charges. The FBI has opened an investigation into Detective Thompson's conduct, particularly regarding his treatment of minority suspects and witnesses. Jake felt his stomach drop. Federal charges were a completely different level of legal trouble. Civil rights violations could result in prison time, not just the loss of his job. The scope of his problems was expanding beyond anything he had imagined. Furthermore, the chief continued, we've received notice that the British government is considering filing formal diplomatic complaints. The State Department has been in contact with our office regarding this incident and its impact on U.S.-UK relations. The hearing continued for 2 hours, with the board reviewing evidence from the internal affairs investigation. Jake listened as they described his misconduct in clinical, professional terms. Each incident sounded worse when read aloud in the formal setting, stripped of any context or justification he might have offered. When they reached their decision, Chief Williams looked directly at Jake for the first time during the meeting. Detective Thompson, you are hereby terminated from the Los Angeles Police Department, effective immediately. You will forfeit all pension benefits and are prohibited from seeking employment with any law enforcement agency in California. The words hit Jake like physical blows. Losing his pension meant losing the financial security he had been counting on for retirement. The prohibition on law enforcement employment meant his skills and experience were essentially worthless in the job market. Peterson tried one last appeal. Chief, my client has a family to support. Surely the loss of employment is sufficient punishment without also taking his pension. Mr. Peterson, your client's actions have cost this department hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, public relations damage, and federal oversight requirements. Several of his cases are being reviewed for potential wrongful convictions. The financial impact of his misconduct extends far beyond his personal situation. After the hearing, Jake walked through the headquarters building one last time, turning in his badge, weapon, and other department property. Officers he had worked with for years avoided eye contact or offered awkward nods of acknowledgement. Some seemed genuinely sorry to see him go, while others appeared relieved that his toxic influence was finally being removed. The property sergeant, an older officer named Davis who had known Jake since his rookie days, handled the equipment return with professional courtesy but obvious disappointment. Jake, I've got to ask, what were you thinking out there? This isn't the guy I trained 15 years ago. Jake shrugged and signed the property forms. I don't know, Davis. I honestly don't know what happened to me. Outside the building, the news crews were waiting. Jake's lawyer had advised him to say nothing, but reporters shouted questions as he walked to his car. The questions were about his future plans, whether he felt remorse, and if he had any message for the British people he had offended. Jake kept his head down and walked quickly, but he could hear the camera shutters clicking and knew that photos of his departure would be on news websites within hours. Even his termination was becoming a public spectacle, another chapter in the ongoing story of his downfall. The drive home took him past the street where he had made his first arrest as a rookie officer. He remembered how proud he had felt that day, how certain he was that he was making a difference in the world. That young officer seemed like a different person now, someone Jake barely recognized. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, creditors, and collection agencies. The bills didn't stop coming just because he had lost his job, and Jake was beginning to understand the full scope of his financial problems. His mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, and he had no idea how he would make it. That evening, Jake sat in his empty apartment and calculated his remaining assets. After legal fees and living expenses, he had maybe 2 months before he would need to sell his house and find somewhere cheaper to live. His police pension, which he had counted on for financial security, was gone forever. The television news was running updates about his case, including interviews with law enforcement experts discussing the broader implications of his behavior. One criminologist explained how his misconduct had damaged trust between police and communities, while another discussed the international diplomatic fallout from assaulting a foreign officer. Jake turned off the television and sat in silence, finally beginning to understand the true cost of his actions. The slap had lasted seconds, but its consequences would follow him for the rest of his life. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his future looked increasingly bleak. Tomorrow he would need to start looking for any job that would hire a disgraced former police officer. The man who had once commanded respect and authority was now just another unemployed middle-aged person with a criminal background, competing for positions that paid a fraction of his former salary. The full weight of his downfall was finally settling in, and Jake was beginning to realize that losing his job was only the beginning of his problems. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who rang Jake's doorbell at 7:30. Through the peephole, Jake could see the official-looking documents in the man's hand and knew immediately what they contained. He had been expecting them for weeks, but seeing the divorce papers still felt like a physical blow. "Are you Jake Thompson?" the process server asked when Jake reluctantly opened the door. "Yeah, that's me." "You've been served. Have a good day, sir." Jake closed the door and leaned against it, holding the legal documents that would officially end his 12-year marriage. His wife, Linda, had moved out 3 weeks earlier, taking their 2 children to stay with her sister across town. She had left a brief note saying she needed time to think, but Jake knew she wasn't coming back. The paper spelled out everything in cold legal language. Linda was seeking full custody of their 8-year-old daughter, Amy, and 10-year-old son, Kevin. She wanted the house, half of all assets, and alimony payments. Her lawyer had painted Jake as an unstable and potentially dangerous individual, whose violent behavior made him unsuitable for unsupervised contact with children. Jake's hands shook as he read the allegations. Linda described years of emotional abuse, explosive anger, and controlling behavior that had made her afraid to speak up or leave. She detailed incidents where Jake had screamed at the children for minor mistakes, punched walls during arguments, and threatened to make her life difficult if she ever tried to divorce him. The worst part was that most of what she wrote was true. Jake had always justified his behavior as stress from his demanding job, but reading Linda's account forced him to see his actions from her perspective. He had been a bully at home just as much as he had been at work, using intimidation and anger to control everyone around him. His phone rang constantly with calls from his lawyer, creditors, and reporters. Jake had stopped answering most calls, but when he saw his mother's number, he reluctantly picked up. "Jake, honey, I saw the news again today. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" His mother's voice was full of worry and confusion. She was 72 years old and had spent her entire life being proud of her son, the police officer. Now she was watching him become a national symbol of police misconduct and abuse of power. "I'm fine, Mom, just dealing with some legal stuff. Your father is very upset about all this. He doesn't understand what happened to you. We raised you better than this." The disappointment in her voice was harder to bear than all the public criticism combined. Jake's parents had always been his biggest supporters, bragging to their friends and neighbors about their son's career accomplishments. Now they were probably embarrassed to leave their house. "Mom, I made some mistakes. I'm trying to fix things." "Mistakes? Jake, you hit someone on television. The whole world saw it. How do you fix something like that?" Jake didn't have an answer. He had been asking himself the same question for weeks without finding any solution. Some problems were too big to fix, too public to overcome. This was one of them. After hanging up, Jake walked through his empty house and tried to remember when everything had started going wrong. The place felt like a museum of his former life. filled with family photos and memories of happier times. Wedding pictures, birthday parties, family vacations, all evidence of the life he had destroyed through his own actions. In the living room, there was still a hole in the wall from when he had punched it during an argument with Linda 6 months ago. He had been angry about something trivial, maybe a bill that hadn't been paid on time or dinner being late. The exact reason didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that his children had seen him lose control and had learned to fear their father's anger. Jake's reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Through the window he could see his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, standing on the porch with a concerned expression. She was an elderly woman who had always been friendly, often bringing cookies for the kids or chatting with Linda about gardening. "Hello, Jake. I wanted to check on you. I haven't seen Linda or the children in a while." Jake opened the door but didn't invite her in. "They're staying with Linda's sister for a while. We're having some problems." Mrs. Chen nodded sympathetically. "I saw the news coverage. It must be very difficult for your family." The kindness in her voice almost broke Jake's composure. This woman was treating him with more compassion than he deserved, more than he had shown to most people in recent years. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that I'm not the same person you saw on TV. I mean, I am. But I'm not dangerous to you or anyone in the neighborhood." She studied his face for a moment before responding. "Jake, I've lived next door to you for 8 years. I've heard the shouting, seen the police cars that came by sometimes when neighbors called about domestic disturbances. I know you're not a bad person, but you've been an angry person for a long time." Her words hit harder than any news commentary or legal document. Mrs. Chen had been watching his decline from close range, witnessing the pattern of behavior that had finally exploded into international headlines. "I used to see you playing with Amy and Kevin in the backyard when they were little," she continued. "You seemed like such a loving father then. What happened to that man?" Jake couldn't answer because he didn't know. Somewhere along the way, the stress and pressure of police work had changed him into someone he didn't recognize. The authority and power he wielded at work had corrupted his relationships at home, turning him into a tyrant who demanded respect through fear rather than earning it through love. That afternoon, Jake received a call from his lawyer with more bad news. Linda's attorney had filed additional motions requesting emergency custody orders and restraining requirements. They were arguing that Jake's history of violence and current legal troubles made him a potential threat to his family's safety. "Jake, I have to ask, is there any truth to these allegations about domestic violence?" Jake stared out his window at the backyard where his children used to play. "I never hit Linda or the kids, but I yelled a lot. I scared them sometimes when I got angry. I punched walls, threw things, made threats about what would happen if Linda left me." His lawyer sighed heavily. "That's still domestic abuse, Jake. Emotional abuse and intimidation are serious issues in custody cases. Combined with your recent criminal charges, we're looking at very limited visitation rights at best." The reality was sinking in deeper with each conversation. Jake wasn't just losing his job and his reputation, he was losing his family. His children would grow up knowing their father as the police officer who embarrassed the country and lost control of his life. They would probably be better off without him. Meanwhile, while Jake's world was collapsing, the man he had slapped was receiving recognition and support from around the world. Sergeant Hayes had returned to England to a hero's welcome, praised for his dignity and restraint under attack. The British press had portrayed him as a symbol of professionalism and grace under pressure. Hayes had been invited to speak at police academies and international conferences about maintaining composure in difficult situations. His calm response to Jake's assault had become a textbook example of how professionals should handle provocation and abuse. Jake watched news coverage of Hayes receiving a commendation from the Queen herself for his service and conduct during the incident. The ceremony was broadcast internationally, with commentators praising Hayes as an example of the best qualities of law enforcement officers. The contrast was devastating. While Hayes was being honored for his restraint and professionalism, Jake was facing criminal charges and public disgrace. One man's career was reaching new heights while the other's was ending in complete ruin. As evening approached, Jake sat alone in his empty house and tried to imagine what his future looked like. No job, no family, no reputation, and very little money. At 43 years old, he was starting over with nothing but debt and notoriety. The silence was broken by his phone buzzing with a text message from his daughter Amy. "Daddy, When are you coming to see us? I miss you. Jake stared at the message for a long time before typing back. I miss you too, sweetheart. Daddy has some problems to fix first, but I love you very much. It was the truth, but Jake wasn't sure if love would be enough to repair the damage he had done. Some mistakes were too big for apologies, and some consequences were too severe for second chances. He was learning that karma didn't just come back fast, it came back with compound interest. 6 months after the incident that destroyed his life, Jake Thompson sat in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of town, watching the evening news on a small television he had bought at a pawn shop. The apartment was a far cry from his former suburban home, thin walls peeling paint, and the constant noise of traffic from the busy street below. The news anchor was reporting on a ceremony at Scotland Yard in London, where Sergeant Hayes was receiving the Commissioner's Award for Distinguished Service. Jake watched as the man he had slapped stood proudly in his dress uniform, surrounded by colleagues and dignitaries who praised his professionalism and grace under pressure. Sergeant Hayes has become an international symbol of how law enforcement officers should conduct themselves, even when faced with unprovoked aggression, the reporter explained. His calm response to the assault by an American police officer has been studied in police academies around the world. As an example of maintaining dignity under attack, Jake reached for the remote to change the channel. But something made him stop. He needed to see this, needed to understand what he had lost and what Hayes had gained from their 30-second encounter that changed both their lives forever. The ceremony continued with Hayes giving a speech about respect, honor, and the importance of international cooperation in law enforcement. His words were measured and thoughtful, showing the kind of leadership and wisdom that Jake had once believed he possessed. When we wear the uniform, we represent more than ourselves, Hayes said to the assembled crowd. We represent our countries, our values, and our commitment to justice. How we conduct ourselves in difficult moments defines not just our character, but the reputation of everyone who shares our profession. Jake felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed these words as meaningless ceremony and political correctness. Now unemployed and alone, he was beginning to understand what Hayes meant. Every officer's actions reflected on the entire profession, and Jake's moment of rage had damaged trust and relationships that took decades to build. His phone buzzed with a text message from his court-appointed job counselor. Interview tomorrow at 2 p.m. for warehouse position. Dress professionally and arrive early. Jake looked down at his only remaining suit, wrinkled and showing signs of wear from months of job interviews that led nowhere. Tomorrow he would sit across from another hiring manager, who would inevitably recognize his name and politely explain that they had decided to go with another candidate. The warehouse job paid $12 an hour with no benefits. It was honest work, but it represented everything Jake had lost. From a respected detective making $70,000 a year with full benefits and a pension, to a middle-aged man competing for entry-level positions that barely covered his basic expenses. His bank account had $43 left. The unemployment benefits had run out 2 months ago, and his small savings had been consumed by legal fees and basic living expenses. Jake had been forced to sell his house for less than he owed on the mortgage, and even that money had been eaten up by divorce settlements and attorney costs. The knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Jake wasn't expecting anyone and rarely had visitors in his new neighborhood. Through the peephole, he could see a young woman with a notebook and a man with a camera. Reporters had found his new address. Mr. Thompson, I'm Jessica Rivers from Channel 7 News. Could we have a few minutes to talk about where you are now, 6 months after the incident? Jake considered ignoring them, but he knew they would just camp outside until he responded. He opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. I have nothing to say to you people. You've already said everything that needs to be said. Sir, we're doing a follow-up story about the consequences of police misconduct. Some viewers are interested in whether you've learned anything from this experience. The question hit Jake like a slap. Had he learned anything? Every day brought new lessons about humility, consequences, and the fragility of the life he had taken for granted. But explaining that to a news crew felt like another form of public humiliation. I learned that 30 seconds of anger can destroy 30 years of life, Jake said quietly. I learned that respect has to be earned, not demanded. And I learned that the person I became was someone I wouldn't want to know. The reporter pressed for more details, but Jake closed the door and returned to his television. The news had moved on to other stories, But Jake's mind was stuck on Hayes' ceremony and the recognition he was receiving for handling Jake's assault with dignity. That evening, Jake did something he hadn't done in months. He picked up his phone and searched for information about Hayes' background. What he found was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Hayes had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, where he had been wounded twice while protecting civilians. He had joined the Royal Guard specifically because he wanted to serve his country in a meaningful way after his military service. Jake read interviews where Hayes talked about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their circumstances. He spoke about learning from difficult experiences and using challenges as opportunities to grow stronger. In one interview, Hayes was asked directly about the incident with Jake. "I don't harbor any anger toward Detective Thompson," Hayes had said. He was clearly dealing with personal struggles that led to poor decisions. "I hope he's able to find peace and learn from the experience. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them." The grace and forgiveness in Hayes' words were almost too much for Jake to bear. This man had every right to be angry, to demand justice, to hold grudges. Instead, he was showing the kind of character that Jake had spent years pretending to possess. Jake's phone rang, showing his daughter Amy's number. These calls had become less frequent as the months passed, and supervised visits revealed how much Jake's children had been affected by his behavior and the family's collapse. "Hi, Daddy, Mom said I could call you." "Hi, sweetheart. How are you doing?" "I'm okay. I started a new school. The kids here don't know about, the thing on TV." Jake's heart broke a little more. His 8-year-old daughter was already learning to hide her connection to him, already understanding that her father's actions had consequences for her too. "Amy, I want you to know that what happened doesn't change how much I love you and Kevin. Daddy made some very bad choices, but that's not your fault." "I know, Daddy," Mom explained it. "She said you were sick and needed to get better." Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that Jake was still struggling to accept. He had been sick. Sick with anger, pride, and entitlement that had poisoned every relationship in his life. After the call ended, Jake sat in his small apartment and took honest inventory of his situation. No career, no family, no reputation, and very little hope of rebuilding what he had lost. At 43, he was starting over with nothing but the hard-earned knowledge of what he had become and why he had fallen so far. The television was now showing a rerun of a police drama full of heroic officers making split-second decisions to save lives and catch criminals. Jake remembered when he used to see himself in those characters, believing he was one of the good guys fighting to protect society from chaos and danger. Now he understood that the real test of a police officer, or any person in authority, wasn't how they handled criminals or emergencies. It was how they treated people who couldn't fight back, how they used their power when no one was watching, and whether they could maintain their humanity while wielding authority over others. Jake had failed that test completely. His badge had become a license for bullying, his authority had become a tool for intimidation, and his uniform had become a costume that hid his true character. From the world and from himself, the warehouse job interview tomorrow would be another small step in a very long journey toward rebuilding some kind of life. Jake didn't know if he would ever be able to repair the damage he had done to his family, his community, or his own soul. But for the first time in months, he was beginning to understand that trying to become better was the only path forward. As he prepared for bed in his small apartment, Jake thought about Hayes' words about learning from difficult experiences. The British sergeant had turned a moment of assault into an opportunity to demonstrate grace and professionalism. Jake was still learning what his own moment of violence had taught him, but he was finally ready to listen to the lessons. Tomorrow would bring another day of trying to rebuild from the ruins of his former life. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not be successful, but it was the only chance he had to become the person he should have been all along. The reckoning was far from over, but at least now Jake understood that it had begun.